There's a truth I've hidden a moment that almost shattered everything I held dear to this day. It feels surreal to even think about it, like a bad dream that clings to the edges of my reality. My name is Olivia, and I live what many would consider an idyllic life. My husband, Daniel, is the love of my life. We've built something solid, something real, after years of navigating life storms together. And then there's Ethan, his son from a previous marriage. A young man I've grown to care for deeply. Though not without effort, it was a typical evening in our home. One of those nights where everything feels comfortingly routine. We'd share dinner as a family. Daniel cracking his usual dry jokes. Ethan rolling his eyes in the way only teenagers can. The house still carried the aroma of baked chicken and rosemary mingling with the faint vanilla scent from the candles. I had earlier the evening faded into quiet as I retreated to our bedroom, the soft hum of the ceiling fan lulling me into a sense of calm. Our room is my sanctuary. The bed, with its plush duvet and countless pillows, feels like a cloud. The walls are painted a soothing grey, adorned with pictures of trips Daniel and I have taken together, moments of laughter and love. Frozen in time as I slid under the cool sheets that night. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows that danced across the walls. I remember thinking how perfect everything seemed. At that moment, Daniel was in his study, wrapping up some work. Ethan had retreated to his room after dinner, likely glued to his phone or his video games. The house was still save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the distant sound of the dishwasher running in the kitchen. As I lay there, my thoughts wandered to how far we'd come. As a family, Ethan and I hadn't always had the easiest relationship. He was reserved, sometimes standoffish, but I had worked hard to bridge the gap I'd supported him in. Ways I hoped he'd one day appreciate, attending his school events, remembering his favourite meals, giving him space when he needed it. Yet even with the strides we'd made, there was always a distance I couldn't quite close. Ethan was a mystery to me, a mix of teenage angst and a guardedness that often felt impenetrable. But I told myself it was normal that we were navigating the complexities of blending families, and in time things would smooth over as sleep began to tug at me. I thought of Daniel. He was my anchor, my safe place in a chaotic world. His love had carried me through some of my darkest days, and I felt grateful for him, for us, for the life we had created. The sheets were soft against my skin, and the rhythmic whir of the ceiling fan was almost hypnotic. I closed my eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over me, but little did I know that tranquility was about to be shattered in a way I could never have imagined. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about trust and boundaries, was about to come crashing down. It started subtly, so subtly, that first I didn't even realise something was wrong. But in the quiet of that night, a secret began to unravel, one that would change everything. It wasn't just one moment. It was a series of tiny, almost imperceptible things that at first I dismissed as my own overactive imagination. But looking back now, the pieces fit together in a way I can't ignore. Ethan was always polite, always well-mannered, but there were times when something in his behaviour fell off. I remember one evening when he hugged me goodnight. It wasn't unusual, he'd done it before, and it always felt like a gesture of affection, of bridging the gap between us. But that night, his arms lingered just a moment too long, his hands resting lower than they should have. I felt my body tense as a subtle but undeniable unease creeping over me. I laughed it off, patting his shoulder and stepping back quickly. "Good night, Ethan," I said, keeping my tone light, as though nothing was out of the ordinary. Then there were the looks. At first I thought I was imagining them, but as time went on I couldn't ignore the way his eyes sometimes lingered, not just looking, but observing in a way that felt almost invasive. I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. His gaze fixed in a way that made my skin prickle. I turn away quickly, pretending not to notice, but the discomfort lingered long after, and then there were the comments. They were always veiled in humour, always easy to dismiss as the awkward attempts of a teenager to navigate boundaries one evening, as I leaned over the kitchen counter to reach for a pot on the shelf. Ethan chuckled, careful. Olivia, you might give someone a heart attack bending like that. I froze for a moment, my hand gripping the handle of the pot, my cheeks burning with a mix of embarrassment and irritation. I forced a laugh, brushing it off as a joke. You're ridiculous, I said, shaking my head and turning back to the stove, but the comment stuck with me, replaying in my mind long after dinner was over. I started questioning myself. Was nothing but the truth was I didn't feel comfortable in my own home anymore. The worst part was the doubt that crept in, the constant questioning of my own perception. Am I making this up? Am I overthinking everything? I'd stare at myself in the mirror, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it all. But then another incident would happen. A touch that lingered too long, a look that made my stomach tighten, and the cycle would start all over again. I couldn't bring myself to talk to Daniel about it. What would I even say? I think your son is making me uncomfortable, but I'm not sure if it's all in my head. It sounded ridiculous even to me. And so I stayed silent, burying my unease and trying to carry on as though everything was normal, but nothing about it felt normal. Something was wrong, and deep down, I knew it. I just didn't know how to face it or what it would mean for my family if I did. That night started like so many others. The house was quiet, blanketed in the soft stillness of late evening. I could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fan above its rhythmic were blending with the occasional creak of the house. Settling the sheets were cool against my skin, and I'd nestled into the familiar comfort of my pillow, letting the weight of the day slip away. Daniel was still in his study finishing up work, and Ethan was in his room. Or so I thought. Sleep came slowly at first, my mind drifting in that hazy space between consciousness and dreams. It was the kind of night where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, where peace felt almost tangible until it wasn't. I don't know what woke me at first. A shift in the air maybe, or the faintest whisper of movement. But then I felt it, a soft, almost imperceptible touch. It started light, barely there, brushing against my calf. Then, moving upward, my first instinct was confusion. Groggy and disoriented as I was, had I imagined it was I dreaming? But the sensation grew more distinct, more deliberate. The touch was cautious, but purposeful, tracing the bare skin of my leg under the thin barrier of my nightgown. My body stiffened instantly, the warmth of sleep replaced by a cold wave of realization. I kept my eyes closed, my breath shallow, every muscle in my body screaming for me to do something. Anything. But I didn't. I couldn't. My mind was racing too fast to make sense of what was happening. The touch moved again, hesitating but insistent as if testing boundaries. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it could be heard. In the silence of the room, I tried to focus on the details, desperate to understand the pressure of the hand, the way it lingered, the unmistakable sensation of something so horribly out of place. In the sanctuary of my bed, I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that I was imagining things caught in some cruel dream, but the reality was undeniable. The intrusiveness of the touch, the weight of it. It was real, and it was Ethan. I stayed perfectly still. My mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What was he doing? Why and how could this even be happening? The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave, raw and suffocating. This was Ethan, the boy I had worked so hard to connect with, to care for as though he were my own. The boy who had sat at my dinner table, shared in our family jokes, and hugged me goodnight. And now he was here in the darkness of my room, crossing a line so sacred, it felt like the air itself had been stolen from my lung. LS, I shifted slightly enough to send a subtle signal that I might be waking. The touch stopped abruptly, the presence retreating like a shadow melting into the night. My heart continued to race my body, frozen in the aftermath of what had just happened. I opened my eyes, slowly scanning the room. The faint glow of the moonlight. Through the curtains illuminated the outline of a figure slipping out of the door. Ethan, my stepson. Shock coursed through me, followed by a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the pressure building in my chest, but I stayed silent, paralyzed by the weight of what I had just experienced. The room felt colder, now emptier. The warmth I had always associated with our home was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to mock me. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind replaying the moment over and over again, dissecting every detail. How long had he been there? What had he been thinking, and why hadn't I done anything? The questions were relentless, each one cutting deeper than the last. I felt violated, betrayed, and utterly alone. This wasn't just about the physical act. It was the destruction of trust, the shattering of a bond I had worked so hard to build. When I finally heard the soft click of the study door and Daniel's footsteps heading toward the bedroom, I panicked. What could I say? How could I explain what had just happened without destroying everything? I pulled the sheets tightly around me, fidgeting sleep as he climbed into bed beside me. "Good night, love," he murmured, his voice warm and familiar. I wanted to respond, tell me feel welcome in their lives, but even in those early days, there were moments that made me pause. Subtle things barely noticeable at the time, like the way his eyes would linger a little too long when I entered the room, or how he'd hover just a bit closer than necessary when we were standing in the kitchen together. At the time, I chalked it up to teenage awkwardness. After all, he was navigating a lot, a new woman in his father's life, a home that no longer revolved solely around him when Daniel and I got married 2 years later. Ethan seemed genuinely happy for us. He gave a heartfelt speech at the wedding, talking about how grateful he was to have me in his life. His words brought me to tears, and in that moment, I felt like we had truly become a family. But as the years went on, little things began to surface. Ethan's compliments, once innocent, started to feel more personal. "You look beautiful today, Olivia," he'd say, his tone lingering in a way that made me uncomfortable. Or, "Dad's lucky to have you said," with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. There were also times when he seemed overly attentive, offering to help with chores or finding excuses to be alone with me. I told myself it was his way of seeking connection, of trying to bonded with me in the absence of his own mother. But there were moments when his presence felt too close, too invasive, like he was watching me in ways he shouldn't. Ethan's relationship with his mother had always been a sensitive subject she left when he was just a baby, choosing a career abroad over the responsibilities of parenthood. Daniel had raised Ethan on his own, pouring all his energy into being both father and mother. I think a part of Ethan resented her for leaving. Even if he rarely talked about it, her absence left a void in his life, one that Daniel tried his best to fill, but couldn't entirely. When I entered the picture, I became the closest thing to a maternal figure Ethan had ever known. I wanted to be there for him, to offer the love and support he deserved. But looking back, I realized that I may have underestimated how much his mother's absence shaped him. Blending our family wasn't always easy. There were times when I felt like an outsider, navigating the delicate balance of being a stepmother. Without overstepping, Ethan was respectful. Yes, but there was a guardedness about him, a reluctance to fully let me in. Still, I worked hard to build a relationship with him. I attended his soccer games, celebrated his achievements, and made a point of including him in family decisions. I wanted him to feel valued, to know that he wasn't losing his father, but gaining someone who cared for him deeply. But as the years went on, I started to notice cracks in the foundation of our relationship. Ethan's mood swings became more frequent, his behaviour more unpredictable. He'd go from being overly attentive to distant, and sullen, often retreating to his room for hours on end. I attributed it to teenage angst, the natural rebellion that comes with growing up. There were times, though, when his actions crossed the line. I remember one summer evening when we were cleaning up after a barbecue. Daniel had gone inside to take a phone call, leaving Ethan and me alone in the backyard as I reached across the table to gather plates. Ethan leaned in closer than necessary, his hand brushing against mine. "Sorry," he said quickly, his voice light, but his eyes told a different story. There was an intensity there, something I couldn't quite place, but couldn't ignore. Moments like these became more frequent over time. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was being paranoid. He's just a kid. I'd remind myself he doesn't mean anything by it, but each interaction left me with a growing sense of unease. Ethan's challenges with his mother and the pressures of blending our family created vulnerabilities. I didn't fully understand at the time. He craved attention, validation, and connection needs that I tried to meet, without realizing the complexity of what was unfolding now. In hindsight, I can see how the pieces fit together, how the subtle red flags I ignored were leading to something far more troubling. I wanted so badly to believe in the family we were building, to see the best in Ethan, that I overlooked the signs that something was deeply wrong, and that oversight would come at a cost. I was unprepared to face the days that followed. That night was some of the most confusing and tormenting of my life. I woke up the next morning with the weight of what had happened pressing heavily on my chest. It was as though the air in the house had changed, thickened with a suffocating tension. I couldn't escape my mind, replayed the moment over and over again, dissecting every detail. The sensation, the realization, the cold betrayal, it all haunted me. The shame hit me. First, had I somehow caused this? Had I been too kind, too nurturing? Did I miss something along the way that I should have addressed? Then came the anger at Ethan for crossing a line so sacred it felt like a slap in the face to Ishuk's unaffected Ed. Carrying on as though nothing had happened, he'd greet me in the mornings with his usual polite smile, make small talk over dinner and offer to help with chores. But as the days wore on, I noticed subtle shifts in his behaviour. There were moments when he'd catch my eye and hold my gaze a little too long, his expression unreadable but charged with something that made my skin crawl. Other times he seemed almost smug, as if daring me to say something. And then there were the moments that felt almost manipulative, like the night he lingered in the kitchen after dinner, helping me clean up even though I hadn't asked. "You seem different lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. "Are you okay?" The question sent a jolt of panic through me. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Are you sure?" He pressed his voice soft but insistent. "You can talk to me, you know." I forced a smile, willing my hands to stop trembling, as I scrubbed at an already clean plate. "I'm fine, Ethan," I said firmly, hoping the finality in my tone would end the conversation, but his words lingered long after he'd left the room, planting seeds of doubt in my mind. Was he genuinely concerned, or was this some twisted way of maintaining control? My relationship with Daniel began to suffer under the weight of the unspoken truth. At first, it was small things snapping at him over trivial matters, avoiding physical affection, retreating to bed early to avoid conversation. Daniel noticed, of course, "What's going on with you lately?" he asked one evening as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the glow of the TV flickering between us. "Nothing," I said quickly, too quickly, he frowned, setting down the remote. "It doesn't feel like nothing. You've been distant. Did I do something? Something wrong?" His concern only made the guilt worse. "It's not you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just tired." Daniel reached for my hand, his touch warm and familiar, but it made my chest ache with the weight of what I was hiding. "You know, you can talk to me, right?" he said gently. I nodded, forcing a smile. I didn't feel. I know I said, but the words felt hollow. Our once easy connection began to fray. Small disagreements escalated into arguments that neither of us knew how to resolve. Daniel grew frustrated with my evasiveness, and I grew resentful of his unknowing presence in a house that felt increasingly foreign to me. The isolation was unbearable. I couldn't confide in anyone, certainly not Daniel and not any of my friends or family. The shame and confusion kept me silent, and the silence only deepened the chasm between me and the life I once knew. Ethan, meanwhile, continued to hover on the edges of my world. His presence, a constant reminder of what had happened and what I couldn't bring myself to confront every interaction with him, felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between maintaining appearances and keeping my distance. The tension in the house was palpable, an invisible storm cloud that hung over us all. And as the days turned into weeks, I realized that something had to give. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a web of fear, guilt, and unspoken truths. But the question remained, how could I take the first step toward untangling this mess without unraveling everything else in the process? The answer felt as elusive as the peace I so desperately craved. I couldn't keep living like this. The weight of what had happened was suffocating me, seeping into every corner of my life. The silence was unbearable, a constant reminder of my fear and my failure to act. I knew something had to change. I had to take back control for days. I wrestled with the decision, should I confront Ethan directly? Should I go to Daniel, or should I seek outside help? Someone neutral who could guide me through this minefield. Each option felt equally terrifying, but doing nothing was no longer an option. One evening after another, tense and silent dinner, I made my decision. I would confront Ethan, whatever the outcome I needed. Answers I needed to reclaim my sense of safety, my sense of self. I waited until Daniel was out of the house. He had a late meeting at work, and I knew Ethan would be home alone with me. My heart pounded as I paced the living room. Rehearsing what I would say, I wanted to be firm, but calm, clear but not cruel when I finally called Ethan into the room. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What's up?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something in his eyes, something guarded. I took a deep breath, stewing myself. "Ethan, we need to talk about what happened that night," I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to stay composed. His expression changed instantly, the casual demeanour of vapour-ated, replaced by a flicker of panic that he quickly tried to mask. "What night?" he asked, his tone defensive. "You know what night I'm talking about," I said firmly. Meeting his gaze, "The night you came into my room for a moment." He said nothing. His jaw tightened, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Then he let out a bitter laugh. I don't know what. Sheer audacity of his words left me momentarily speechless. Tears burned in my eyes, a mix of anger and betrayal. "How could you do that?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "How could you violate my trust like that? Ethan, after everything I've done for you, after everything we've built as a family." He looked away, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he muttered. I wasn't thinking. Not thinking." I repeated, my voice trembling with disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand how wrong this is?" For a moment his bravado faltered. He looked down his shoulders, slumping slightly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow, like they were spoken out of obligation rather than genuine remorse. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions raging inside me. "Sorry isn't enough, Ethan. This can't happen again. Do you understand me? It cannot happen again." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the floor. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The conversation ended there, but the tension in the room was suffocating. I watched as he left the living room, retreating to his room without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, I sank onto the couch, my body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation I'd taken the first step. But the path ahead still felt uncertain and fraught with challenges. I knew I couldn't stop here. This wasn't just about Ethan. It was about my marriage, my family, my sense of security. I needed to talk to Daniel. I needed him to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The thought of that conversation terrified me, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of strength. I had confronted Ethan, and I had survived. Now, it was time to take the next step and face whatever came next. The night I decided to tell Daniel, the sky seemed to echo, the storm brewing inside me. Rain pattered steadily against the windows, a rhythmic reminder of the turmoil I was about to unleash. The living room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a table lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Daniel sat on the couch, his laptop balanced on his knees, utterly unaware of the bomb I was about to drop. I took a deep breath, gripping the back of the armchair for support. "Daniel," I began, my voice trembling. Despite my resolve, he looked up, his brow furrowing at my tone. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting the laptop aside. I hesitated, the words clawing at my throat. How could I say this without breaking him, without shattering the life we'd built? But there was no easy way, no gentle approach. "It's about Ethan," I said, finally the weight of his name almost too much to bear. Daniel's expression shifted, confusion giving way to concern. "What about him? Did something happen?" I nodded, the first tear spilling over before I could stop it. Yes, something happened. I told him everything, every detail, every moment of that night, every instance of unease leading up to it. My voice cracked, under the strain, but I forced myself to keep going, laying be the truth I'd been carrying alone for too long as I spoke. I watched the emotions play out on Daniel's face. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a deep, gut-wrenching pain. When I finished, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the rain. Daniel sat there staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. "Are you saying Ethan touched you?" he asked, his voice low, almost disbelieving. I nodded, fresh tears spilling down my cheeks. "Yes, he came into our room that night and crossed a line. I never thought he would." Daniel stood abruptly, his movements sharp and agitated. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair. "I don't understand," he muttered more to himself than to me. "Why would he do something like that? He's my son. He's not like that." I don't know why I said, my voice breaking. "But it happened, Daniel, and I can't keep pretending it didn't." But before either of us could say more, the sound of a door opening upstairs interrupted us. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "He must have overheard Dad. I can explain," he said, his voice shaky but defensive. "She's making it sound worse than it is." Daniel turned to him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Explain, Ethan. What the hell is there to explain?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze darting between us. "I didn't mean to. I was just," he faltered the words, dying in his throat. "It was a mistake." "Okay, I wasn't thinking a mistake." Daniel's voice was rising, now the anger and betrayal evident in every word you call, sneaking into her room in the middle of the night. "A mistake? Do you have any idea what you've done to her, to this family?" Ethan's defensiveness turned to desperation. "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know why I did it. I wasn't thinking straight." The tension in the room was unbearable, thick like the storm outside. Daniel looked at me, then back at Ethan, his face a mix of fury and heartbreak. "Go to your room," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "But Dad, now," Daniel shouted, the force of it reverberating through the room. "Ethan," streaming down my face, "but we have to figure it out together." The emotional fallout was immediate and devastating. Ethan stayed in his room for the rest of the night, and Daniel couldn't bring himself to look at me. His pain too raw to process the next morning, the house felt like a battlefield. The echoes of the previous night's confrontation lingering in every corner, the family we had built. The trust we had cultivated now lay in ruins, and I couldn't help but wonder if we would ever find a way to rebuild. But one thing was clear. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The storm had broken, and all we could do now was weather it together or music apart. In the weeks that followed, the house felt like a shell of its former self. The laughter and warmth that once filled our home were replaced with heavy silences and cautious glances. But amidst the wreckage, I began to process what had happened. Not just that night, but in the weeks, months and years leading up to it, what Ethan did had changed me. It shattered the trust I had placed in him and made me question everything about myself, my instincts, my boundaries, my worth. But it also forced me to face the truth that I had been carrying this burden alone for far too long, allowing it to poison my sense of safety and security confronting him. And later, Daniel was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was also the first step toward reclaiming my life. Daniel, to his credit, didn't shy away from the truth. He struggled, of course he did, but he stood by me. We started counselling together, working through the anger, the guilt, and the fractures in our relationship. Daniel also arranged for Ethan to see a therapist, something he should have done years ago, given all the unresolved pain from his mother's absence. Rebuilding trust was not easy. Some days I wondered if it was even possible. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to see glimmers of hope. Daniel was committed to doing the work, both for our marriage and for his relationship with Ethan. And while it will take time, perhaps years for us to truly heal, I started to believe that we could, through this experience. I learned the importance of boundaries, not just with others, but with myself. I realised that I had spent so much time trying to be everything for everyone that I ignored my own instincts, my own need for safety and respect. I learned that it's okay to demand more from the people around you, to set firm lines that cannot be crossed. And I discovered a resilience cement in myself that I didn't know existed. What happened was not my fault, and I refused to let it define me. I am more than that moment, more than the pain it caused. Sometimes the hardest truths bring the most clarity. I thought one evening as I sat on the back porch, watching the sunset, it wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was the one I had, and I was determined to make it better. One day at a time. Healing is not linear. Some days are harder than others, and there are moments when the weight of it all feels unbearable. But there are also moments of light, of laughter, with Daniel, of quiet reflection, of knowing that I took control of a situation that could have destroyed me. I don't know what the future holds for our family, but I do know this: I am stronger than I ever thought possible. And for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful. Hopeful that we can rebuild. Hopeful that I can heal. And hopeful that despite everything, life will move forward.